The restaurant had the kind of quiet that felt practiced, rehearsed for money. Low amber lights floated above white tablecloths like restrained moons, and every sound, cutlery touching porcelain, the slow pour of wine, a distant laugh, arrived softened, as if wrapped in velvet. Outside, rain pressed gently against the tall windows, tracing thin, wavering lines down the glass. Inside, warmth hovered, heavy with butter and herbs and the faint sweetness of baked bread. I arrived 10 minutes early, as I always did. Old habits cling longer than pride. I stood near the entrance, smoothing the sleeves of my coat, feeling the familiar flutter of nervousness I hadn't quite learned to silence. My son had chosen this place. Somewhere nice, he'd said, smiling with that open, boyish expression that still surprised me now that he was grown. Somewhere nice usually meant somewhere expensive, somewhere I worried about ordering the wrong thing. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself tonight wasn't about me. When they walked in, I noticed them immediately, not because of how they looked, but because of how the room seemed to adjust around them. My son, tall, shoulders slightly hunched like he was still growing into himself. And beside him, Camille. His fiancée. Elegant without trying, dark hair pulled back just enough to reveal her neck, her smile quick and bright and already scanning the room. She kissed my cheek lightly, air more than skin. "Bonsoir," she said, then laughed softly, switching to English. "Sorry. Habit." "That's all right," I replied, smiling. My accent flattened the word all right into something heavier. She didn't notice. Or she did, and chose not to. We sat. Wine was ordered. Conversation moved carefully, like a polite dance. Camille spoke about her work, her colleagues, a recent trip to Paris. My son listened, eyes on her face, nodding at the right moments. I listened too, adding small comments when I could, careful not to interrupt the rhythm she seemed to set. It wasn't that she was unkind. Not overtly. It was subtler than that. A glance exchanged with the waiter when I asked about a dish. A pause, just a fraction too long, before answering one of my questions. A smile that cooled before it reached her eyes. I noticed these things the way you notice a draft in an otherwise warm room. You don't immediately know where it's coming from, only that something is off. When the food arrived, the table filled with steam and scent. Camille leaned toward my son, murmuring something in French. He smiled, shrugged. I caught a few words. Not enough to form a sentence. I lowered my gaze to my plate. Halfway through the meal, it happened. The waiter asked if everything was satisfactory. I nodded, perhaps too eagerly. Camille tilted her head and said something in French, her voice light, musical. She didn't lower it. She didn't look at me. She smiled at my son as she spoke. Elle est gentille, mais un peu. Perdue, she said. Sweetly. On dirait qu'elle n'est pas elle habited de ce genre d'endroit. She's nice, but a little lost. It looks like she's not used to this kind of place. My fork paused midair. There it was. Clean. Casual. Delivered like an aside, like something harmless. My son laughed quietly, not unkindly, not cruelly, but he didn't correct her either. He didn't look at me. The room didn't change. The lights stayed warm. The rain kept falling. But something inside me folded inward, slow and precise. I understood every word. I had learned French decades ago, back when life had promised more than it delivered. Night classes after work. Tapes played softly while my son slept in the next room. I had learned it because I loved the way it sounded. Because it felt like opening a window to another life. Eventually, responsibilities crowded it out, but the language stayed. Quiet. Waiting. I chewed slowly, carefully. I tasted less. Heat climbed up my neck, not sharp, not explosive, just steady, humiliating warmth. I considered, briefly, responding. A simple sentence. Perfect pronunciation. Her surprise would have been immediate. Instead, I swallowed. Camille went on talking, switching back to English as if nothing had happened. I nodded when appropriate. I smiled when expected. Inside, something fragile had been pressed, just enough to crack. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of politeness. When dessert came, I declined. I said I was full. That part wasn't a lie. As we stood to leave, Camille hugged me, tighter this time. "So nice to finally spend proper time together," she said. I returned the hug gently. "Yes," I said. It was. Outside, the rain had slowed. The air was cool and clean. My son offered to walk me to my car. I told him not to worry. He hesitated, then nodded. As I drove home, the city lights streaked across the windshield, reflections bending and breaking. Her words replayed in my mind, not angrily, not even sadly, just there, like a bruise you keep touching to confirm it exists. That night, lying awake, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the quiet hum of the house. I didn't cry. I didn't rehearse arguments. I only wondered when, exactly. I had become invisible enough to be spoken about as if I wasn't there. And whether silence, this time, was really the kindness I'd always believed it to be. The days after the dinner moved with an unsettling normalcy. Morning light still spilled through the kitchen window. The kettle still whistled. The world, indifferent as ever, continued on its path. But something had shifted in me, subtle yet undeniable, like a compass needle slowly turning. Camille texted once, thanking me again for dinner. I replied politely. Briefly. My son called, his voice warm, familiar. He talked about work, about plans for the wedding venue. I listened, responding when needed, careful not to let anything seep into my tone. He never mentioned the restaurant. I never brought it up. At night, though, when the house settled into its soft creaks and sighs, my thoughts returned there. Not to the words themselves, but to the ease with which they had been spoken. To the assumption beneath them. That I wouldn't understand. That I wouldn't matter. I replayed the moment from different angles, searching my memory for signs I might have missed before. The small smiles. The gentle corrections. The way Camille sometimes spoke over me, finishing my sentences with a brightness that felt more like replacement than help. I asked myself difficult questions. Had I allowed this? Had my quiet nature, my habit of stepping back, created the space for this kind of dismissal? One afternoon. Weeks later, I received an invitation. Camille wanted to host a small dinner at their apartment. Just family, the message said. A heart emoji followed. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. My first instinct was refusal. A polite excuse. But something steadier rose beneath the hesitation. A resolve that surprised me with its calm. I replied that I'd love to come. Their apartment was modern, all clean lines in pale wood, windows stretching from floor to ceiling. Music played softly in the background, French, of course. Camille greeted me with enthusiasm, ushering me in, taking my coat. Throughout the evening, she moved gracefully, confidently. She spoke often in French to my son. Especially when discussing the food, the wine, little private jokes that floated just out of reach. I noticed how naturally he followed her lead, how quickly he slipped into her rhythm. At one point, she turned to me, smiling. "You don't mind, do you?" she said in English. "When we speak French like this?" "Not at all," I replied. And I meant it. Dinner was served. Conversation flowed. At some point, Camille made another comment in French, lighter this time, amused. Elle est toujours si silencieuse. On dirait tu elle observe tout. She's always so quiet. It's like she's observing everything. My son chuckled. She's always been like that. I set down my glass carefully. Yes, I said, in French, my voice steady, unhurried. I observe. It helps me understand people better. The table fell into a silence so complete it felt physical. Camille's smile froze, then slowly reshaped itself into something more cautious. Her eyes flickered, searching my face. "Oh," she said. You speak French. I do, I replied gently. Quite well. My son looked between us, confusion blooming into realization. Mom! You never told me. I never needed to, I said. My tone held no accusation. Only truth. For a moment, no one spoke. The music continued, unaware. Outside, the city murmured. Camille recovered first. That's wonderful, she said, laughing lightly. I had no idea. I know, I said. You assumed. The word hung there. Not sharp. Not loud. Just present. The rest of the evening passed differently. Camille was more careful with her language. Her glances. She included me more directly, asked questions, listened really. Listened to the answers. My son watched quietly, something thoughtful settling into his expression. When it was time to leave, Camille hugged me again. This time, there was hesitation in her arms. On the drive home, I felt lighter. Not triumphant. Not vindicated. Just aligned, as if I'd finally stood where I was meant to stand all alone. I knew this wasn't the end. Understanding had been revealed, but accountability still lingered, unspoken. And I suspected Camille knew it too. What mattered was that the silence between us had changed shape. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. A week passed. Then another. The air grew cooler, the evenings shorter. I noticed how often my son called now. How his questions lingered, how he seemed to listen more closely when I spoke. Something in him had shifted too, subtle but sincere. One evening, he asked if he could come by. Just him. We sat in the living room, the familiar space holding decades of memory. He looked around as if seeing it anew, his gaze landing on old photographs, worn furniture. He took a breath. I didn't know, he said finally. About the French. About how she spoke. I know, I replied. He frowned slightly. I should have noticed. Yes, I said. Not harshly. Just honestly. He nodded, absorbing the weight of it. I talked to her, he added. She was embarrassed. She said she didn't mean any harm. I believe her. I said. Intent isn't the same as impact. He exhaled, slow and thoughtful. I want you to feel respected. Always. I reached over, covering his hand with mine. Then listen, I said. When something feels off, even if it's quiet. The next time I saw Camille, it was different. She invited me for coffee, just the two of us. No audience. No distractions. We sat by the window of a small cafe. Sunlight streamed in, catching the steam from our cups. She looked nervous, her elegance softened by sincerity. I owe you an apology, she said, in French. Carefully. I was careless. And arrogant. I met her gaze. Thank you, I said. For saying it. She nodded, eyes bright. I hope, with time, I can do better. So do I replied. There was no grand reconciliation. No dramatic speeches. Just understanding, placed gently between us. As I walked home, the city felt different. Not because it had changed, but because I had. Dignity, I realized, isn't reclaimed through confrontation alone. Sometimes it's restored through presence. Through knowing when to speak, and when to let silence carry the truth. That night, I slept deeply. And for the first time in a long while, the quiet felt like peace.